Saturday's attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump was just the high point of a multi-year campaign of demonization and political violence that has plagued the United States and much of the Western world, first and foremost Israel, for the past 15 years. I'll have the information about the context in which this assassination attempt took place coming up on In Focus. Well, like I said, Saturday's assassination attempt against the former president didn't come out of nowhere. And in this In Focus, I want to talk to you about the origins of what we saw on Saturday. I know a lot of you already know this stuff, but I want to point out the incredible parallels between what we've been seeing in Israel since 2011 and really what we've been seeing in the United States since around the same time. Because I would say that the assassination attempt that we saw on Saturday that miraculously didn't kill President Trump, and it was just, like millimeters away from blowing his brains out, which is incredible that he survived this and is in good condition, that this basically started as a campaign of political chaos and violence that the left has been sowing in the United States and in Israel and throughout Europe and the Western world since 2011. And I want to just go into it a little bit with you guys here. So a lot of you may remember the Occupy Wall Street movement in the United States that began in September of 2011. What most people don't realize is that the Occupy Wall Street chaos, which I'll go into a little bit in a second, was preceded by a very similar move inside of Israel called the Occupy Rothschild campaign that began 2 months earlier in July of 2011. Now, what was Occupy Rothschild? Just like Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Rothschild Boulevard is where the stock exchange in Tel Aviv is located, was a protest that was organized by left-wing groups funded by American philanthropists, whether it's George Soros or S. Daniel Abraham, the New Israel Fund. A consortium of left-wing, progressive, largely Jewish donors were behind this supposedly mass campaign of protest against income inequality in Israel and the high price of living conditions, the high cost of living in Israel. So that began the Occupy Rothschild riots that we saw in Israel in the summer of 2011, and then 2 months later, in September of 2011, the Occupy Wall Street riots began in Lower Manhattan. So these two protest movements or riots, organized riots, were very, very similar. And they were organized and funded by very similar and interlinked actors, both in Israel and in the United States. That included George Soros, that included the New Israel Fund and progressive American Jews, Ford Foundation, other progressive NGOs and foundations behind the funding of these supposedly mass protests in Tel Aviv, and then 2 months later began in New York. And the same concept sort of organized both of them, which was in order to oust the right wing from power. In the United States, this was before the 2012 re-election. This was before the 2012 elections where Barack Obama was running for re-election. And it was also in Israel before the 2011 elections here. The idea was we want to bring the left to power. In the United States' case, keep the left in power by sowing the seeds of demonization of the right. In the United States, it was the edifice of capitalism that is the basis of the American economy and American military power, American economic power, American cultural power around the world. And in Israel, it was the idea that the political right was responsible for income inequality, high cost of living in Israel, et cetera, and leftist, social democratic, social justice, so-called organizations were coming to remedy through their mass riots on the streets of Tel Aviv. And the basic concept was the same: use organized riots, organized chaos that was funded by deep-pocketed donors in the United States, in Israel, and in the United States, in order to demonize of the society, in order to demonize the government. And these protests that began in 2011 then morphed into further protests as the years progressed. So, and parallel campaigns of lawfare, of the use of law as a means to carry out political warfare against your political opponents by the left side of the political spectrum in the United States and in Israel, and increasingly in Europe, as we saw in Austria and other places, and in Latin America, as we're seeing now with Bolsonaro in Brazil. And throughout the world, the idea that you can criminalize your opponents, you can demonize your opponents, blaming them for all of the ills of your society, and at the same time induce a state of constant political chaos and violence in your society that's organized around the concept that your political opponents are demons and that they're illegitimate. And that is something that is a common denominator in Israel and in the United States, as I see it most blatantly, but people in Europe see it as well in their own countries, that there's this constant drumbeat of delegitimization and demonization through the use of rioting and mass violence that is supported by the liberal media, that is supported by left-wing political elites and often incited by them, and that then is carried out on the ground by deep-pocketed organizations that seem to have sprung up from nowhere overnight, that are being funded by billionaires on the left. That's what we've seen in Israel beginning back in 2011. That's what we've seen in the United States beginning in 2011. And it's just continued to expand and to morph and become more and more violent with each passing year. So, for instance, in Israel, we saw the beginning of the legal warfare against Prime Minister Netanyahu beginning in 2015, where you started having mass protests against then Attorney General Avichai Mandelblit by the same leftists who were behind the Occupy Rothschild protests in 2011. So that's people in Israel, they're very well known, like Eldad Yaniv and others, who were behind this protest movement demanding that the Attorney General of Israel begin to carry out criminal probes against Prime Minister Netanyahu based essentially on nothing. But it was this idea that there's something basically criminal about Netanyahu. This was after he was reelected in 2015 for a fourth term. That the left wing just decided that the best way to go about things was to demonize him as corrupt and as a criminal. And they did this through mass protests in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, in Petah Tikva, against first the Attorney General, and then after the Attorney General opened criminal probes against Netanyahu in answer to their constant demands and harassment. You had Netanyahu protested as prime minister. That was the first time we started seeing signs against him as prime minister, demonizing him as a criminal, demonizing his family, of course, and demonizing his supporters as being supportive of a corrupt politician. In the United States, around the same time, you saw right after Trump was elected president, in fact, before he was elected president in the 2015 elections, you saw at the beginning of the slander campaign against him that he was a Russian agent. And in both cases, in the case of Donald Trump and the hunt for Donald Trump by the left wing, you saw that it was instigated by the media, by fake news that was coming out of the media, alleging that he had nefarious contacts with Russia. They were then supported by, and as we saw later in the investigation of the Russia collusion hoax, they were aided and abetted and leaked by FBI agents who were working in hand in glove with the Clinton presidential campaign through various networks, through the DNC, through what we saw in later years in work by people like Lee Smith, who put out the definitive studies of what happened with the collusion and cooperation, and in some case leadership of senior operatives inside of the FBI, senior officers inside of the FBI, supported by the media or with the active collusion of the media, New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, CBS News, etc. They were putting out these stories, one after the other, that criminalized President Trump as a Russian agent. None of it was true, but we saw the full-on collusion between the legal system, the Attorney General that refused to investigate what was going on, the leaks, the illegal leaks that were going on in the attempt to criminalize President Trump and his senior aides, and then impeach him, and the FBI that was involved with expanding and producing, creating these blood libels against Trump. In Israel, we had the same thing going on with the legal system that was carrying out unlawful probes against the prime minister, not asking for the attorney general's permission, which is against one of the basic laws of Israel, that the attorney general has to separately and in writing approve every separate criminal probe of the prime minister. That didn't happen in Israel. They started illegal wiretaps against Prime Minister Netanyahu's close associates, began leaking fake news to the media about alleged corruption of the prime minister and his close advisors. You saw President Trump's closest advisors being subjected, like former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, to criminal probes against them for nefarious ties to foreign governments, to nefarious ties to Russia in particular. And then you saw in Israel very similar probes being carried out against senior advisors, senior aides to Prime Minister Netanyahu, and Netanyahu was alleging that they committed treason in carrying out a purchase of submarines from Germany, and a whole host of other things which have all fallen apart in trial. And yet these were the kinds of things that were informing a public discourse that was totally false about Prime Minister Netanyahu, about his closest advisors, about his family members, that were carried out together by rogue or at least politicized leaders of Israel's legal fraternity, the attorney general, the state prosecutor, senior subordinates of these two leaders of the legal system, with a collusion of judges who were turning a blind eye to illegal wiretaps going on in Israel, the use of spyware against the prime minister's family, against his closest associates, without any permission from legal authorities. Same thing in the United States, what we saw with the illegal eavesdropping of people like National Security Advisor Michael Flynn and other people close to the President of the United States, and the use of these illegal wiretaps against the President's senior advisors in order to criminalize the entire Trump administration. And then those were then at the same time joined by mass political violence, riots, a sense of enduring political chaos in the United States. You saw it with the race riots over George Floyd, obviously, in 2020. You saw it in riots against racial injustice, perceived racial injustice during the COVID lockdowns, both in Israel and the United States. You saw these mass use of political violence and riots that were sanctioned by legal authorities that were banning all public events and even worship in Israel and the United States, banning people from meeting, and then allowing these mass protests by leftists against Trump on the one hand and against Netanyahu on the other hand, and the idea was to demonize them, to delegitimize them, to criminalize them in the eyes of the people, to criminalize their supporters, to cultivate the sense of political chaos, that everything was falling apart in the United States. Obviously, it reached its height to date in the United States in the summer of 2020 with the George Floyd riots, the Black Lives Matter riots throughout the country, where you saw the full use of political warfare, of political violence by the left against American voters, against the the elected authorities of the United States in the name of social justice, in the name of anti-racism, in the name of whatever, and a complete abandonment of law enforcement against these rioters, against these looters, against these violent protesters by legal authorities in democratic state after democratic state, democratic city after democratic city, so that you had this enduring chaos and fear that set in among the public, that there was and there was nobody in charge. In Israel, you had the same thing with these mass campaigns of political violence outside of the prime minister's residence in 2019 and 2020 and 2021. In 2020, and I think in 2021, we saw Netanyahu ousted from power. Then he came back into power in 2022, and you saw this constant drumbeat of incitement against him, against his family, against his supporters, and 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 of course his criminalization. He was indicted on 3 charges that have, in the 3.5 or 4 years of his trial, all of them have fallen apart on the witness stand during the defense's case presentation. So the prosecution has just finished its case, and the defenses will have to start theirs. But basically, under normal circumstances, the justices or the judges that are presiding over Netanyahu's trial would have dismissed all of the charges years ago, because they've all fallen apart on the witness stand as the prosecution has presented its case. In the United States, you have a similar situation playing out, where it's already been clear that the Trump-Russia hoax, for which, numerous reporters at the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, I think, and at the Washington Post received Pulitzer Prizes, that all of their stories were lies, that none of it was true, that Trump never colluded with Putin, that there was never anything to any of the claims against him. And yet nobody's paid a price for this professionally. Nobody's paid a price for this with the public stature which they're greeted in the media. No FBI officials, aside from being fired, none of them have faced criminal prosecution for their actions, for their abuse of their powers. Nothing has happened to any of these people, either in Israel or in the United States. And in the meantime, you have this constant sense that political violence is totally acceptable, and it's really not violent when it's coming from the left. And here you have the central role that legal authorities in both countries have been playing in all of these operations through the discriminatory use of law enforcement. Both in the United States and in Israel, you see unequal justice being meted out against people on the right on the one hand, where you see the full force of legal authorities being brought to bear against right-wingers who are accused of any sort of law breaking, any sort of illegal protest, any sort of, illegal actions of any kind, or semi-legal or questionable actions of any kind. And on the other hand, you have leftists who have literally broken through the security perimeters outside of Prime Minister Netanyahu's private residence in Jerusalem and in Caesarea, time after time, called for his killing, called for the killing of his family. And rather than being punished, rather than being arrested, they receive covers of news magazines in the newspapers and are lionized by the media as heroes of democracy. And that's the other thing that we see that runs across both sides of the Atlantic, in the demonization, the delegitimization, and the criminalization of the political right and its political leadership from the left, which is that it is supported by the legal fraternity, that the legal fraternity will not enforce the law against left-wing rioters, against incitement to murder, against actual illegal acts being carried out in these riots by leftist, anarchists, Hamas supporters, or anything else. And so when you see what's happening on both sides, when you see it whether in Israel or in the United States towards Trump and towards Netanyahu in Israel, you see that you have a triangle, of extremely well-funded writers that are being underwritten by billionaires in Israel and in the United States. You have legal authorities who are not carrying out their law enforcement activities equally towards all citizens of societies, but rather are not enforcing the law when it relates to left-wing political violence, and they are over-enforcing, you might say, particularly in light of the non-enforcement on the left side. They're over-enforcing the law in the process of criminalizing, demonizing, and delegitimizing activists on the political right, and of course the right-wing politicians. And finally, excuse me, you see the leadership of the left, both on the media and politically, that are participating in a years-long campaign of demonization against the political leadership and the membership of the political right. I just want to show you real quick, just so you understand the level of incitement here in Israel against Netanyahu. We can then compare it to what Pelosi and Biden and so many commentators and so many other Democratic leaders have said against Trump. Just watch this. It is a compilation that the cabinet secretary, Yossi Fuchs, played at the cabinet meeting today. But, this stuff has been going on for years.
נתניהו בוגד, הפך לאויב העם.
הוא האויב הכי גדול של העם היהודי ב-200 שנה האחרונות.
כל ביביסט יקבל כדור בראש.
אתה בוגד.
אנחנו מחכות עם חפץ ליד!
אבל הוא בעצם שטן!
זה מה שמגיע לכם! חפץ ליד!
ואני מקווה שמה שקרה לאחאב ולאיזבל בשומרון יקרה גם לו.
זה סרטן שפשוט מעכל את הנשמה שיוצרת את עם ישראל.
המלחמה שלנו מאז 7 באוקטובר היא אולי נראית מול החמאס, אבל בואו, המלחמה האמיתית היא מול אויב מבפנים, המלחמה היא מול ביבי נתניהו והממשלה שלו.
אני לא חושב שאנחנו יכולים להישאר מחאה בלתי אלימה. בסוף נצטרך לקחת את נתניהו ולהוציא אותו בידיים.
להכניס אותם לתוך חדרים, לנעול אותם, להתפצר סביבם, לשים כמה בלונים של גז.
אתה האויב האמיתי, או נסע לאויב האמיתי.
For instance, in the United States, in the days leading up to the assassination attempt against President Trump on Saturday, you had both Nancy Pelosi, the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, and President Biden making statements about former President Trump that were arguably calls for violence against him, that Pelosi said that he has to be stopped at all costs. Here you can look at the clip right here.
This is not a normal election where you want to win. If you don't, you cooperate and do the best you can for the country and hope to win the next time. This is something that is undermining our democracy, and he must be stopped. He cannot be president.
And President Biden said that he needs to have a bullseye placed on his head. Yeah, that we're moving past the debate. So you have this kind of political incitement in Israel. You have the same thing with opposition leader Yair Lapid attacking every single thing that Prime Minister Netanyahu does. Prime Minister Netanyahu gave a press conference on Saturday night, and Lapid immediately castigated it. He said that the apparent assassination, killing, we hope it was successful, of the Hamas leader Mohammed Def, that was a terrible act by Prime Minister Netanyahu aimed directly at preventing a hostage deal with Hamas, which, by the way, would be a terrible deal, which right now is being negotiated, but without even any connection to this. Mohammed Def was one of the top military targets in this war, from the perspective of him being number 2 in Hamas after Yahya Sinwar, and he's considered the chief of staff of Hamas's terror forces. So if he was in fact assassinated on Saturday, it's unbelievable that the head of Israel's opposition would oppose that, but he did. And then when Prime Minister Netanyahu gave a press conference where he talked about a whole host of things, and not only the assassination, Lapid immediately castigated him and said, he's not there for the victims of October 7th, and he only takes credit for the achievements of the war, which is manifestly not true. But it's all part of a constant drumbeat of demonization, delegitimization, and criminalization of Prime Minister Netanyahu that Lapid is engaged in, that Benny Gantz is engaged in, that, the further left that you go on the political spectrum, the more hysterical become the denunciations till you get to the people on the streets calling for the murder of Netanyahu and his family, and their obliteration from the annals of history as the modern day form of Amalek, as a worse enemy than Hezbollah, and the greatest enemy, the greatest threat to Israel ever. And so you have the media, the opposition, supporting the demonization, delegitimization, criminalization of the right and the right's political leaders. You have the legal fraternity enforcing the law with gross discrimination, gross prejudice, non-enforcement towards leftist political violence, over-enforcement towards right-wing political violence. And finally, you have lawfare being conducted against right-wing leaders, as we saw with the 2 impeachments of Trump, the 4 indictments of Trump, 94 charges as he's running for president. And, you have so much more with Trump also, the deplatforming on Twitter and on Facebook that followed the 2020 elections, and more and more and more. So these kinds of things have become endemic in our politics. And the final thing that is common both in Israel and in the United States is that all of this political violence, all of this criminalization, all of this delegitimization, all of this lawfare that's being conducted by left-wing political elites, judicial elites, legal elites, and billionaires funding these rioters on the streets, is that they're doing it all. They're making their case that they are the protectors of democracy, that if Trump rises again to power, that if Netanyahu remains in power, that they pose a manifest threat to democracy, and that the only way to save democracy is by ousting Netanyahu from power and by keeping President Trump out of office. And to this end, all actions are justified, including, in the case of the United States, having a man serve as president and then run for re-election, who, as the entire world saw during the presidential debate, is suffering from what appears to be a very severe form of dementia. And so you have an American president who seems incapable of actually leading, who is being managed by people behind the scenes whose names are unknown to the public, whose policies are being directed by people who are unaccountable to the public. And there is Biden in charge. And in Israel, you have an entire campaign to delegitimize not only Prime Minister Netanyahu, but his political supporters. What happened on Saturday was so notable, aside from the fact that it's miraculous that Trump wasn't murdered, is the laxity of the protection of President Trump. That people have pointed out that eyewitnesses say that they saw the gunman climbing onto the roof of the building closest to Trump, and there were no Secret Service agents there. There were no drones in the air giving the Secret Service 360-degree control of the area. And people were pointing at the gunman as he was going up to the roof of that building, and while he was there, to Secret Service and to the police, and just in the moments before he began shooting, and they didn't do anything. And and in Israel, the sense that it's totally okay to break through the cordons of protection against Prime Minister Netanyahu and his family in Jerusalem and in Caesarea, time after time after time, with no punishment whatsoever being meted out, nobody being arrested for doing these kinds of things. And this brings us to the question of how can we trust that our elected leaders, whether they're President Trump, who miraculously was not murdered yesterday, or Prime Minister Netanyahu, who miraculously hasn't been murdered, despite this incredible violence and this disregard of the importance of the incitement, this disregard, this dismissal of the threat that this leftist political violence organized poses to political leaders and to individual citizens in the United States by legal authority. That is, of course, the most severe, the most acute, the most urgent threat that all of our democracies are experiencing today. Because if they're able to murder President Trump, if they're, God forbid, able to murder Prime Minister Netanyahu, then there is no democracy. And I mean, this is exactly what we experienced as well with the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin in 1995. That, you know, Rabin may have been elected or defeated at the polls in 1996 in the expected elections, but that was for the public to decide, not for the gunman to decide. He's not supposed to get a vote in the elections. He's not supposed to be able to determine the outcome of elections. That's what democracies are about. So by enabling political violence, by giving license to political violence in our societies, you see that the left is actually saying, in the name of democracy, that democracy is no longer acceptable. And why is it no longer acceptable? And this goes to the heart of things. It's because they don't accept the legitimacy of the people that they oppose. The left increasingly throughout the world rejects the legitimacy of their political opponents. And why is that? It's because it's not a political movement per se, what we're seeing with this cultural Marxism, with this post-nationalism or globalism. It's a revolutionary movement. Revolutionaries brook no compromise. They're trying to fundamentally, in the words of President Obama, fundamentally transforming their societies. And if your society needs to be fundamentally transformed, you're not dealing with a normal political dispute between opposing sides of a political fence. You're dealing instead with an existential war between people who think that a country and a way of life should be preserved and people who believe that a country and a way of life should be destroyed and replaced with something else. And that's what we're facing. So the elites who are talking about, killing Prime Minister Netanyahu, killing President Trump, putting a bullseye on his head, destroying, blotting him out of history, whoever, and this is both leaders, it's almost the exact same rhetoric, just as almost all of the political violence going on in the United States and Israel has been carried out simultaneously with almost identical messaging on both sides of the Atlantic. There's this idea that there's something fundamentally illegitimate about people who are trying to preserve their societies, whether it's Israel as a Jewish state or the United States as a constitutional republic with checks and balances, with, 3 co-equal branches of government that's predicated on a certain set of values that until recently were common to all Americans, regardless of where they stood on the political spectrum. So you have an unraveling of societies because one side of the political spectrum has become opposed. That's not the word I was looking for, but has become is no longer willing to accept the way that politics are run in their country because they are rejecting the basic values of their societies and the legitimacy of the people who aren't going along with them. So, I don't know what's going to happen in either Israel or the United States. Everybody wants to talk about unity and for the need to have responsible discourse. And I'm the first one to agree with that. But what we're seeing here is that the left in our countries is rejecting the fundamental legitimacy of the right. And so long as that continues to be the case, you can't really have any meaningful unity. You can't have a meaningful national discourse because a national discourse to be fruitful, to lead you anywhere, to be meaningful to both sides, has to be predicated on mutual recognition of all sides of legitimacy of one another. And when you have one side that rejects that, then then there's no way to have a real, a meaningful discourse. So, I don't know where this is going to lead. I'm very, very concerned about our paths going forward. But I hope, and I guess the one thing that I can take comfort in, and I guess we all should, and hope that it's the beginning of something new, is that I saw on MSNBC last night, right after the attack on Trump, I saw that you had people who were saying that, we have to cool the discourse, we have to take a step back, we have to start looking for, points of agreement in society and stop with the demonization. And I hope very much that that's the beginning of something real and not just the immediate response to this horrible assault on American democracy through the assassination attempt against former President Trump just days before the Republican National Convention. I think you have to see the left. The only people that can fix this situation, the only people who can really save our societies from a further descent into madness and chaos, are the people who induced it. And they are on the left. They are the ones who have been carrying out now for 13 years a continuous campaign of demonization, criminalization, and delegitimization of the right side of the political fence in all sorts of different ways, but it's always the same people at the core of all of these operations. And it's always that union of the media, legal authorities, and billionaires who are funding mass riots in the streets of our cities throughout our countries. Israel is now, of course, embroiled in a great war, which was very much a product of the political chaos and the calls for civil war that were being sounded on a daily basis by left-wing elites in Israel in the year that preceded October 7th. We see where this has led in Israel. We see where it has led with the assassination attempt against former President Donald Trump in the United States, and it just has to stop. But again, there's only one side that can really stop it, and that's a side that's been carrying out this campaign of political violence and chaos for the past many, many years, and that's the left. So God willing, you will see that the calls for calm and eschewals of political violence that we saw in the United States immediately after the attempted murder of President Trump, we can only hope that they will continue, because I think that's the only way that we're going to be able to remedy the ills of our society and move forward and really together protect our democracies from demise. So those are my thoughts today. God bless President Trump, and he should be healthy. God protect him. God protect Prime Minister Netanyahu and all of us as we go forward, hopefully to secure and protect and preserve our ways of life and our societies. Have a good day, and I'll talk to you again soon.